Welcome to the Being Known podcast with my friend, the Bionic Man, Dr. Curt Thompson.
Oh my gosh. And my friend, Pepper Sweetie.
We are here to discover and explore we are here to discover and explore what it means to be truly known.
Oh my
Gentlemen,
goodness.
we can rebuild him. We have the technology. We have the capacity to be able to make him brand new, the first Bionic Man, Dr. Curt Thompson. Better than he was before. Man. Better, stronger, faster. Those that are not watching us on video right now, Curt is a one-armed bandit right now. He's with his shoulder all surgery up. What happened, Curt?
Yeah. Well, kind of just a long-term athletic injury that just finally gave way, and my rotator cuff of my left shoulder needed to be repaired, and so got that done about 10 days ago, and glad to have weathered that. The surgery itself was not too complicated, and recovery in the short term has been pretty straightforward. The tricky part is recovery, which is anywhere between 6 and 12 months.
Oh, boy.
And you're in a sling for at least 6 weeks, anywhere between 6 and 12 weeks, and you can't really do anything. At least for 6 weeks, there's no active motion. You only, like, the physical therapist can, like, move your arm and do stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. Twist it behind your head.
Yeah. So will you start physical therapy then? But not until,
Yeah, next week.
Okay.
Hopefully. Yeah. But it'll be the kind of thing where they're going to be, it's just like, don't move your arm. Let me move your arm.
Yeah.
And, okay. For the most part, I'm being pretty, it's been okay. But man, like, dude, like 3 nights ago, I kind of got awake because I'm sleeping in a recliner because, I wake up and I just had this irrepressible urge to want to just jump out of my chair and start stretching my arm and moving my shoulder, kind of like you're trapped in a box.
Yeah.
You just gotta get out.
Right.
Oh man. I kind of passed through the moment. It took a couple of deep breaths. Yeah.
That's hard. It's hard to go through. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
My wife has just been such a trooper because she said, we had surgery 10 days ago.
Right.
It's really true that we did. Like, dude, like I can't tie my shoes, for example.
Yeah.
It's but I will say it has been again, it's not it's not life-threatening. And so in terms of what we might call the gravity of suffering, this is one of these moments where it would be tempting to say, look, it's merely a flesh wound, right? It's not, because it's not life-threatening, it really, like, it's really not that big a deal. The suffering doesn't really apply here, but it does, in the sense that, I'm just really aware of how hard Phyllis is working with all the things, like she's cooking meals. She, when they've got this cryotherapy, you put an ice sleeve on it and you run it through ice water's running, in this, it helps keep inflammation down. It's an amazing technology. It's beautiful, but she's got to hook the thing up, like, multiple times a day to keep ice in it and all the things that she's doing. And I'm just super aware of how, man, I don't want to be adding to her burden by, like, being the least bit impatient, irritable, not even with her, but just impatient with me. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't want there to be a ripple in the atmosphere that would add to her burden, because she's already working so hard to love me. And the thing is, the number of moments in which I find myself having to restrain my own kind of responses of impatience or whatever. Again, not with her, but with just like where I am. But so as not to add to the kind of like emotional payload.
Right.
And I'm thinking like, man, it's as if this, these last 10 days, like the Holy Spirit has just pulled the curtain back and revealed all the number of times that I typically do this in the course of normal everyday events. And I'm like, sheesh, I don't want her putting up with this with me, even if it's not about her. Like, who wants to live in, and it's not like it's all day, but I have been made patently aware of the frequency with which I just impulsively do what is easy to do to cope with the distress of the moment. And it's been like a big mirror that's just been thrown up. And I want to be different. And then I will also say this. I'm like, gosh, you get to the end of the day, and in the moment when you're working to restrain, you're like, ugh. It's like restraining from wanting to like throw my shoulder in the air.
Yeah. Yeah.
But at the end of a day, like you go back and you like do a little inventory and you think, I'm really glad I didn't do those things. Like I feel like I'm in a better place because of the work that you're not really enjoying doing in the moment. But then if you have 2 or 3 days like that, you start to see, oh, there's actually payoff for choosing not to behave like a toddler, even though you're physically kind of been reduced to that.
Yeah.
And so it, I don't know, there has felt like in these very small moments of suffering that we might describe that this experience has been this opportunity for, it would sound kind of harsh to say, yeah, well, God's going to use it to train you to be a better man. That's not untrue, but really it's a matter of me also like learning to exhale into the presence of the Spirit in each of those moments and essentially saying like, no, I don't need to react. Like, it's okay. I'm okay. But exercising the muscle of breathing and being okay, like you don't have to do that if A, the situation never presents itself where you have to, or B, I just never exercise the muscle, right? I don't, but it's in exercise. I mean, like, when you do Orange Theory, right? It's like, it's only when they ask you to do things that are really hard to do you become aware of the things that you can't do.
Yeah. Yeah, for
And
sure.
so there's no question that it's like, I'm sure that the divine council kind of all got together and said, hey, we think this would be really helpful for Curt. Let's green light the surgery, get it done as soon as we can, and let's put him on the treadmill.
Yeah.
I'm going to get this boy in shape.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'll be thinking about you, especially as you go into your physical therapy and all that coming up soon. And it's going to be a long process, but well worth it in the long term. So
yeah.
And today we are looking at episode 10 here, which is the final chapter of the Deepest Place book, the chapter 9, which is entitled Full Circle. And let's talk about how do we get to be full circle here. This is a great chapter. I really enjoyed this chapter this week as I was reading through it.
Yeah. Well, I think the take home message is that we this final portion of this passage where Paul writes, and hope does not put us to shame because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. This is the 5th verse of Romans chapter 5. And it's this cycle that we enter into. We begin, if we just as a review, we begin with this notion that faith is really about attachment, which leads to our being willing to bring into the room the parts of us that have believed that we're still at war with God, so that we have peace with God, that leads us to this notion of glory that we've talked about, that we are God's utter delight. And it is in that glory that we revel, such that when suffering comes, we are enabled to persevere because we're doing it in the context of community. And character emerges out of that perseverance as a byproduct. Like, it's the notion of, like, this is who we become. We become people of love and joy, peace, patience, kindness, and so forth. And our developing in this way necessarily means that our anticipated future is one of hope. So hope becomes actually something that we actively form, which is encouraging. It can be hopeful for us, that it reminds us that we have agency to form hope because we're doing this kind of work. And that hope then defends us against shame because of someone, not just something, who's been given to us. This portion, this notion that we remember, we've said this a number of times, that when you look at first century Christians who would have been reading or hearing Paul's words, the gods were capricious and stingy. The gods of the ancient world, they were capricious and stingy. That God would give himself to us, would give us anything without some kind of, strings attached, would just be mind-bending to people. That the Holy Spirit would be given to us, that God's love, his lavishness would be with, like, no, you don't have to pay me anything. You don't have to burn your child at the stake. You don't have to have sex with this person. You don't have to, all the things. Like, no, I'm just going to give myself to you. But to accomplish this requires repetition in a context of community. And, we would like to say to all of our listeners that we know that, we talk about community here a lot. We talk about this notion of being known. And we talk about the value of that community being in person. And there's no question, I think, that if the question is there a difference between being in person and being online, I think the answer is yes. I think there are things that happen in person that don't happen online. But if the question is, if the difference is between being online or not being in community at all, I want to say, by all means, being virtual, being connected to people even over the internet is a beautiful, amazing thing to do. We're seeing this evidence in these confessional communities in CBK. Like, it's just, what's emerging from those is just stunning to me.
Yep.
But frankly, let's just bring it home. Yes, obviously, you and Amy and I have had a lot of in-person experience in the early days with Seasons. Thanks be to God for Nicole Johnson and her vision for that. Shout out to her. But dude, like, Friday mornings at 10 o'clock, my goodness, like, to be with the two of you.
Right.
There's just, you can't put money on that.
Yeah.
And so this notion of practicing all these things in the context of a community is so crucial. And this enables us to then stand in grace because of this body of who we are. We, the three of us, we are a part of the, we're one outpost of God's body of Jesus. And it's not just an idea, it's not a set of ideas, but they are real voices, real facial expressions, real presence that's being with us. And then, so we see that this ongoing work of integration or sanctification just requires our taking seriously the role of suffering. Without knowing it, there's just so many things that we do in an effort to make life more convenient. And don't get me wrong, I like indoor plumbing. But you might say, well, gosh, would you want to live in a world where you didn't have indoor plumbing? Well, not if I knew that indoor plumbing was a possibility. But that's not the right question to ask. because the people who never had indoor plumbing didn't know such a thing could possibly be. So it's not like they were suffering from not having indoor plumbing.
Right.
They didn't know a thing was possible. Nobody would be suffering in 1965 from not having microwave ovens, from not having electricity. Do things change? Yes, they change, but like what matters, what does create suffering primarily is when emotional and physical wounds happen and I'm caught in isolation from this. It's not just the pain that I experience, it's how I make sense of that pain, as we've been talking about over time. But, with modernity and the Enlightenment and so forth, and our illusion and delusion, we might even say, about the notion of progress and what it's doing, like turning us into better human beings. Like you look around at our world, like, hello. But I don't, so I'm on the fast track to get rid of suffering. And when suffering comes, I want to know, like, why. And the reason I want to know is because I want to get rid of it. If I can find out why it's happening, then I can resolve the problem. And Job asked this same question. Job was asking questions. His friends came and they had answers. And here's the thing that it's maddening for us as human beings. And it makes sense because we're still in the business of trying to become like God. But we notice that in Job's situation, like with us, God never explains his suffering to him. He never addresses it. He uses it. God doesn't explain suffering. The biblical narrative does not explain suffering anywhere. It assumes it to be a feature of life, and the question is, how am I going to respond to it? How am I going to respond? There are elements of suffering that we can do something about. You break your femur, we're going to do something about that. But if you have, an incurable cancer, like, are we just going to say, oh, well, we can't do anything about it? No, we're going to be with you. And even if I was going to heal your femur, if I'm the orthopedic surgeon, I still have to be with you in order to do something about it. So still that notion of being present is the hard deck where everything else begins. And so God, I'm the one who wants an explanation so that I no longer have to be a creature. But I'm a creature. I'm one who's been, I'm not the creator. But I do all kinds of things in the course of my day that make me believe that I am. I don't mean to make me believe that I am a creator, as in God's image, which we all are. I mean like the creator, like capital C. But instead, God uses our suffering to draw us ever more deeply into relationship with him and with each other, given the nature of the world in which we live. But I also want to say, as we talk about this, and in the book, we talk about a number of different people who, when they suffer, they move toward integration. They move toward wholeness. But not everybody who suffers moves in that direction, or moves toward wholeness, moves toward joy in the face of their pain. Not everybody does. At some point, there are some of us who, and maybe even some of us who are listening, they reach a crisis point where they can no longer tolerate the intensity of what it means for us to be followers of Jesus in the middle of suffering. Suffering puts us in this position of making the choice of whether or not we are allowing ourselves to be loved in the face of that suffering. Especially if my suffering is something that is going to be a necessary path through to something beyond it. Like and this comes up mostly when people are, we say that we've said here before that we suffer for three reasons: things that happen to us, things that we do to ourselves, and we suffer because we follow Jesus. And following Jesus often necessarily means I'm going to have to give up some of the things that I'm doing to myself. And dude, that is a painful road to take. Like I was saying earlier, like it's easy for me to be irritable. It's easy. I'm good at it. it's Herculean for me to keep my mouth shut when I want to, like, bark at something. It's hard. There's a suffering. I used to cycle, and there was a period of about 10 or 15 years where I cycled quite a bit, and would watch the Tour de France, and these riders, these long distance riders, would talk about the kind of suffering that one has to endure if you're going to do that kind of work. Like when I listen to you talk about Orange Theory,
Yeah.
like, don't tell me that there isn't a certain kind of painful experience that you have to learn to be present to.
Yeah, but it also goes back to, for me, that community that's there. Like I was telling you about this workout that I had today, where we, as like the class was divided into two groups, and we were, as a group, trying to get to a certain place with the amount of exercises that we were doing, the amount of miles we were going on the treadmill, the amount of meters we were going on the rowers, and all these things. And so we were literally like cheering one another on through the whole process because we had a goal that we were all trying to reach. That, if I were in the gym by myself, no way would I have even come close to the suffering that I suffered today.
Right. Right.
In this.
Right.
Yeah.
And so when Jesus names that the gate and the path are ones of narrowness, right? He's saying this to a community. And the point is that despite the fact that the gate and the path are narrow, being on the path with others is a game changer. And for some folks, being on that path, I don't know how often you've watched this ever happen where somebody, is either in the middle of a route of an exercise thing that you're doing, or they they just happen to be in their particular position, particular place of progression in Orange Theory in general, and they just get to a point where they just drop out.
Yeah,
or they just can't do it. And we would say that this happens relationally for us as well. I mean, this notion, we've had people in our confessional communities that just one day they just don't show up. They just don't, and they don't come back, and they don't return our phone calls. Because at some level, what was being asked of them felt like a bridge too far. Love was knocking at the door too closely. Now, for our listeners, we might think like, I don't know, what do you mean? Like, how does, like, if love is at the door, like, who wouldn't want to open the door to love? Well, because we know, right? I mean, love comes as Jesus did, and not only will we not open the door, we're going to kill it, and we do.
Yeah, just this part in on page one. Well, I don't want to say the page number because it might be different in the other book. But suffering begins with pain, but becomes suffering because of our isolation and powerlessness in its presence. Only by risking being receptive to love, something that is very hard for us to do, will we form durable hope. This love is found initially in God coming to find us in Jesus, a journey that began with the pursuit of Adam and Eve. Thus we see that hope is something we form in response to the loving presence of someone else. It is not something we manufacture on our own, right? Yeah.
Never.
Never.
I think about these stories that you're telling about these communal, workouts.
Right.
That you start that workout and everybody's forming hope for everybody else.
That's right.
In the process of that. And so I think one thing I'm just wanting to say is that we know that sometimes it's just difficult for us. And there are people who have a hard enough time with this that they exit relationships. And in our practice, they exit it in a whole. People take their lives, right? People exit relationships. They exit the world catastrophically. And so And they're not doing it because they're pansies. They're not doing it because they're stupid. They're not doing it because they're weak, because they're not working hard enough. They get overwhelmed, and I don't have we don't have judgment about that. I don't. There's no condemnation about that. There is only grief
Yeah.
about that. And sometimes we see that these departures in relationships, we may be in friendships, we may be in churches, we may be in work situations where relationally people just decide they can't do this anymore. Now, we're not talking about here. We're not talking about relationships in which someone needs to exit in order to eliminate violence, right? We're not talking about someone who needs to exit a relationship in which somebody's being abusive, in which somebody's being overbearing. We're not talking about the necessity of setting boundaries for others. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the ways in which people exit relationships in the presence and activity of genuine loving kindness, as we'll see here in just a moment. This notion that sometimes those departures happen quickly, just immediately. Sometimes they happen after long periods of time in which the exit will just shock people. Like, but we thought that they were part of our community. I thought you were my friend. And it's going to surprise everybody except the one who leaves. And we say that these exits people make in order to survive. That's what they would say. I can't tolerate being loved by Jesus. I can't tolerate the gaze, for instance, the look that the rich young ruler, for instance, in Mark chapter 10, 12, couldn't tolerate from Jesus. So this is not the same thing as those who leave toxic relationships. It's more likely that this rich young ruler notion that the entanglement of intimacy is too close with danger, right? I have this notion that all of our trauma takes place ultimately in the context of intimacy, and intimacy is the thing that I long for more than anything, but I have memory of intimacy costing me a great deal in my trauma. And so anytime someone moves to become closer to me, there is the part of me that thirsts for it. But at the same time, I've had so much experience with drinking really, really bad water that when I see that cup of cold water in front of me, I don't know. And so my longing for intimacy is often entangled with my memory of danger, which is why it takes courage for me to stay in the game long enough to let myself be loved by someone else, to then stay in the game a little longer to be loved even more, to stay in the game longer to be loved even more, which is what's speaking to my suffering the whole time. And so this is what brings us, we would say, it brings us full circle, discovering Jesus, who's offering us relief for our suffering, though usually not on our own terms. This full circle, discovering that the healing that we long for in our suffering actually may take our entire lifetime and beyond. This healing, this presence that Jesus offers is that. It is his presence. Sometimes our pain itself is not eliminated. Right? There's a certain sense, not to make too much of this, but like this whole thing with my shoulder. The surgery itself is straightforward, relatively speaking. But now I'm in this sling, not moving my arm for 6 weeks. Just,
Yeah.
right? And, the surgeon, oddly enough, is unapologetic to me that this is what I have to do. It's odd how he didn't, he's not somehow saying, well, I think we can find a different way for you. So no, somehow this is the way. I'm a Mandalorian. This is the way. But the point being that there is no other way to do this, but this is then going to require my needing to be willing to stay in this process. I could easily, I would like to exit this like I did, like I wanted to a couple nights ago. Throw the sling off, stretch out my arm. But invariably that leads to further disintegration. And so when people leave relationships, they may leave because they can't tolerate the intimacy. And so for them, it's like an act of survival in that moment, that fight or flight, because they don't believe they have what it takes. But it only leads them to further disintegration. If we're willing to stay with this, again, just as a reminder that we sometimes, I like to believe that, um, you want to read a book that will tell me how I won't have to suffer anymore.
Right.
I want to listen to this podcast so that they'll give me the clue to eliminate suffering. And instead, it's an invitation for us to recognize that suffering may be with us, will be with us in some way, shape, or form for our lifetime. Of course, this is not what I want to hear in a world that continually, in a culture that continually tells me that, first of all, I shouldn't have to suffer at all.
Right.
And that if I am suffering in any way, shape, or form, that suffering necessarily is only to be understood through a lens of it being a bad thing that can't be used for anything good. And I should be able to hold somebody other than myself responsible for it. And if I can't find anybody here on earth, then I'll blame God. And oddly enough, just like Job, God can say, okay, and yet not explain this to me because he's still waiting for me to let him love me in the middle of it. And it often, this, like I was saying earlier, it often involves discovering areas of suffering that beforehand I'm not even able to name. I mean, like, my becoming aware of parts of me that could easily become irritable because I'm now working hard to not pile onto Phyllis, right? Stuff that, beyond the work she's already having to do. Like I wouldn't even I'm not even paying attention to this. But this particular element of suffering opens the window for me to like, oh. And it's like the woman with the bleeding problem in Mark chapter 5, right? She has an idea. She's got an agenda, right? A healing plan.
Right.
And if I can just get the bleeding stopped, everything will be fine. And it was fine until Jesus stopped the crowd, and then like everything went to hell because he's like, oh, she's like crap, right? And who touched me?
Right.
Because he's aware that her suffering isn't just about her bleeding. Her suffering is about her not having been called daughter in forever. Her suffering is in her isolation. Her suffering is in her cultural shame. I mean, how long is it going to take? She stops her bleeding. Like, who's going to believe it? And how long is it going to take them for her to be clean enough to be back in the community? These are all things that Jesus is now going to publicly address, but not things that she had any interest in him publicly addressing or privately addressing for that matter. And this is how he uses our suffering. It becomes doorways into all kinds of things for us. And so we see that there's a diagram in the the last chapter. There's a diagram that for our readers who are looking at it reminds us that this whole notion of moving from glory to suffering to perseverance to character to hope brings us full circle back to glory. That when we allow ourselves to be loved in the middle of our suffering, there's a picture of it, right?
Yep.
When we allow ourselves to be loved, we enter into this cycle in which suffering, as we've said at the beginning of this season, suffering is something that God honors. It's kind of like your friend invites you to a wedding, and you don't just go because you want to go. You go because you want to honor your friend. Your friend has their child has a graduation, and you go to their graduation party because you want to honor them. You honor by being present. We are the most honorable gift that we can give, being present. And when in Jesus we get to Good Friday, we have the story of a God who's made a world in which we've really messed things up. and we can't get ourselves out of it, and we need a rescuer. And he doesn't rescue us from a distance. He doesn't just send angels. He tried that. He honors the mess that we're in by coming and taking us out the other side. And it's into that suffering that he comes and he goes and brings us, so that we too can catch a glimpse of, can begin to practice and to recognize how even what he's doing in us in our suffering is going to be the beginning of something that will show up in the new heaven and new earth. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is wasted in God's economy. So, for our listeners, nothing is wasted in our suffering. God uses it to create beauty and goodness in ways we could never imagine.
Thank you, Curt. This has been so amazing going through the book, chapter by chapter, and you teaching on each chapter as I've gone through and read it, because I have. I've done it like our listeners are doing it, and I found it to be so helpful. I had coffee with a guy the other day, and he just mentioned to me that he has a friend who lives out of state, and he sent him a copy of The Deepest Place, and they're going to read it chapter by chapter and listen through this season. And I just want to encourage you, our listeners, that if you're just jumping into this episode or what have you, you can go back and go through this season as we've gone through every chapter. And we have an application for you for this week and beyond. This being the final chapter of the book. So Curt had talked about the diagram that you'll find in the last chapter that represents the journey that we've been traveling. So we want to take time in the coming weeks to meditate on and journal about each element that you find in the diagram. Begin in the center with the body of Jesus and the wisdom of the scriptures. From there, you move out towards the circle of elements that you see, beginning with glory at the top there, and then moving to suffering, perseverance, character, hope, and then back again to glory. Finally, move outward to the triangle that represents and encompasses this entire process, that of the presence of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Time to meditate in particular on what you sense and image and feel when you consider each of these elements. How are you experiencing each of them? Do this over a period of at least 6 to 8 weeks, and then consider what it has been like and what you notice for you to have practiced this exercise. Consider the degree to which you are now hopeful in ways that perhaps you weren't 6 or 8 weeks ago. The deepest place, suffering and the formation of hope. And we are going to next week be taking your questions that you may have for a final episode based on this book. So we're looking forward to that. And those of you who are watching us on YouTube right now, Amy is going to be joining us. So stick around for that. Curt, I love you. Thank you. Appreciate you.
I got
I thought he
power up.
froze.
Okay. No. We didn't freeze. I just realized something.
Oh no.
My computer is about
To
to run out
die.
of power. It's going to run out of power.
Well, you get your power and
You guys talk.
We'll
you guys
talk.
talk. I'll get my cord.
Yep.
You
Do
guys
it.
talk. Okay.
Okay, so there were two things that stood out to me.
Yeah, go.
One was, okay, I'm looking at the notes for the healing of our suffering. Here, let me hold it up like this. The healing of our suffering may take our entire lifetime.
Right.
And in some ways it feels like, are you serious? Like, but to me, that feels like a relief, because then it's not like a destiny. Like, I'm not trying to get to a point where there is no more suffering. It's like the relief is, oh, I can settle into this knowing this is part of the journey.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Almost makes you realize that what you're going through is not beyond normal.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not something to be eradicated because it's not normal. It's
Right.
like, oh yeah, of course.
Yeah. And I think it also helps you to knowing that, Curt talking about people who exit because they can't handle that level of intimacy. They can't handle, I think that knowing that this is a marathon and not a sprint,
Right.
will help you to stay engaged with people and not, fighter,
Right. Yeah, like the idea of the marathon. It's like, oh, okay, settle in.
Yeah.
Because you're in this for the long haul. And
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah.
You had a second thing.
Yes. Okay, the rich young ruler, which we could spend a lot of time on, which we're
Right.
not going to. But I'm looking at the book because, the rich young ruler is told, God says, go sell everything you have
Right.
and give it to the poor. And then further down on the page 183, at least in the version I have, Curt, you say, this is a story about how we build elaborate coping strategies over which we wield tight-fisted control to protect ourselves from our traumas and our shame. And I was like, okay, we all have something to sell. I mean, what I have to sell, my coping strategies, are not what the poor are going to want. But it's like,
or what the rich would want. Maybe, I don't know, but
yes.
but that's
And it's like,
Go
okay,
ahead,
we
go
all, and we can't, so we're really being asked to lay down our coping strategies.
Mm-hmm.
And we cannot do that in isolation. If you're going to leave the room, I cannot tolerate laying down my coping strategies.
Well, Amy, I always, man, I frequently take a great deal of comfort in being aware of and remembering the work that you've done in group in your group work, that community.
Yeah.
That is the very thing that you're talking about. Like, no, you're right. I can't do this. I need the help of other people who are like this whole notion of who are both with loving kindness. They are both like unapologetic about my need to give up my coping strategy, yet without condemnation in terms of the pace at which I'm able to do it.
The snail's pace. Gosh, oftentimes backward pace. Yes.
Yeah. But oh gosh, I love that phrase. We all have something to sell.
Yeah. Yeah.
We all have something to sell. Oh, that's so good.
And then we just, then sometimes, the work is to know what it is that we have to sell. Because
Right.
sometimes we don't know what it is that we don't know our coping strategies.
Well, just yesterday, I had a meeting with my spiritual director. Her name's Ann Halley, and I was talking with her about a thing that has, this particular event that happened in my life for which I am not, like, I still have angsting about this thing. And it is, but my suffering about this has everything to do with my clutching this thing that I feel like perhaps someone else has taken or trying to take. And it would be good for me to sell it. It would be good for me to sell it, because if I sell it and I don't have it, then like there's nothing for anybody to take.
Right.
It's no, and
Yeah.
it's, I no longer attach my need to be okay with the story that I tell that someone has, taken my comfort of some kind. The thing that would be good for me to sell, because it represents my need to protect myself from myself.
It's good work.
I mean, okay, can I just say though, but like, who gets to have conversations like what we're having right now? Who gets to have this?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
I had this conversation after talking with Ann yesterday, and I'm like, yeah, I need to, 2 days ago, I wouldn't even have known that I had a thing that I needed to sell.
Right.
Yesterday, she brings it to my attention that it might
Yeah.
be a thing you might want to sell, and I'm like, hell no.
Right. Yeah. I'm not
And
there
now,
yet.
but now that I'm having this conversation and you're naming it, like, did Ann call you and say, like, I know you're
had
going to
a
be
Zoom
talking to
call
Curt
last
tomorrow.
night, but
I know you're going to be talking to Curt tomorrow. I just want to like let you in on something.
mention selling stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And then just the idea of it, then it's like, okay, then
That's right.
it's not
one
like
of the
you're
things,
like, oh yeah, I'm going to sell that.
right, exactly. I love, there's as you know, my colleague Courtney Morrison, who works together with, she and I run these groups at the practice, and just a person of great clinical experience and wisdom and so forth. And one of the most beautiful things I watch her do repeatedly is when one of the group members is in this moment where it would be good for them to actually take an action on something, and everybody in the group is like poised on the edge of their seat, like, you gonna do it? You gonna do it? Right? Are you gonna sell the thing? And they're like backing into the corner of the couch as far as they can go, screaming, no. Right? And Courtney will pause and say, what if we just do a little experiment here? What if you just imagine selling it? Don't sell it yet. Don't sell it. But let's begin to practice imagining selling. I can't tell you how many times both the person in question is immediately relieved, but without being let off the hook.
It's tolerable.
Right, without being let off the hook. And of course, everyone else in the room, who of course need this person to sell this thing. So because why the reason is because they want to be able to sell things, but
Right.
like, I will if you will, right? So they too, they know that they're also listening to Courtney say, let's imagine selling it. Let's take the first step. At least get up off your towel and walk toward the high dive. You don't even have to go up the ladder, but let's just walk toward the dive. We'll just walk to the high dive.
Yeah. And we're with you as you do this.
That's exactly right. We're going to go together. Yeah. It's good.
It's good.
It's good.
I'm grateful to be doing it with you too.
Me too. Right on.
All right, guys. Thank you for today.
Thank you, Pep. Thank you, Aim. It's beautiful.
Thanks, guys.
See you next
All right,
time.
love you.
Yep.
Love you. See you next time.
This podcast is produced by Curt Thompson, Pepper Sweeney, and myself, Amy Chella. Audio production and editing is by Keaton Simons. Video production and editing is done by Mark Gould. If you'd like to connect with us, you can find us on social media at BeingKnownPod. If you like this podcast, tell a friend. If you love this podcast, tell everyone you know. And please like, rate, and review wherever you listen. Be well, be known.